And joining me now on the show is the CEO of Elevare Technologies, Steve Beaman. Steve, welcome.
Thank you for having me on. It's a great pleasure.
Really appreciate your time today, Steve. And I wanted to talk to you about this story coming out of Russia, where if we go back, Russia had McDonald's, and due to the Ukrainian war and the sanctions being placed, they hurriedly exited the Russian market but sold their licenses to the existing franchisor there. And it's become the version, the English name is Just Tasty. Uses the same menu and it's incredibly successful, so much so that China has now requested for this franchise to then be put into China, but they've hit another snag and it's more logistical than political. And I wanted to get your take on this whole scenario.
Well, I think there's a great deal here, but it starts with the surreal. And that is, as I've told people before, when McDonald's opened in Moscow years and years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they couldn't produce the French fries to McDonald's standards because Russian potatoes weren't good enough. And that's indicative of state controlled government machines. They just don't work that well. And so what you have is a knockoff of McDonald's that will never be as good as the original. And they're going to try to export that to China to bypass sanctions. And it won't be as good as the original. But then again, the knockoffs never are. So I think it's indicative. And again, I've spoken about this openly. It's indicative of the BRIC countries trying to decouple from the West. And this is just another attempt to do that that won't end well for them.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at the decoupling there and the idea that Russia, China, the BRICS countries now at 11 already represent roughly half the world's GDP, half the world's landmass. It is a divide situation. And yet, strangely, the branding of McDonald's, I mean, almost the epitome of US exceptionalism in a way, the idea that you can create something so simple and make it so successful is something that they latch onto.
But what they're going to miss is the idea of quality over quantity. And McDonald's at its core was all about quality. That's why they established as such a successful franchise. As you could go to a McDonald's in Australia or New York City, and it was the exact same food. They're
Mm.
going to lose that as they go through the machinations of, again, that government control. And I think I've made the joke, but it's like Chernobyl. They're going to use cheaper is better, and they're going to have a disaster. But I think the bigger story here is the extent to which these countries really are trying to decouple from the West. They may have half the world's GDP, and I get that statistic, but I don't think that tells the whole story. The Western economies are the innovators. We're the ones who create the new things, whether it's technology, services, or what have you. And I think they will be a second lead or a second class follower to that for the next 30 years. And again, with the problems going on in China, that's not going to help it at all.
Now, going back to this story here, it's a really interesting point that you make because when you're looking at the political sanctions, and the question would be, why wouldn't McDonald's completely sever ties with Russia, pull out? But here they're still behaving as the wholesale distributor of the raw ingredients, and that's what this Russian franchisor is saying, that if he gets permission and they can get the product there, he'll open 10 stores tomorrow. But McDonald's is saying that they don't have the logistical innovations to distribute the food to these areas of China where they haven't been able to get to. And why do you think then that business still gets in the way of the politics at that level?
I think there are two interesting points that kind of come out of this. Number one, the companies will always try to exploit a market where it exists. And when government puts in a given sanction, the company will try to get another area that's not covered by that specific sanction. But the bigger point there is this idea that McDonald's can't logistically get their product into the areas of these countries. Back 40 years ago in the 1990s, 30, whenever that was, I hosted Soviet personnel when it was perestroika through the United States. And one of the real shocks to them was the extent of our distribution systems. We have an incredibly well developed logistics and distribution. They don't have that in China, and therefore it will be difficult for McDonald's to get fresh product in a timely basis to the more outlying areas other than Beijing.
Wouldn't you think that the opportunity would be right there to mimic a McDonald's over in China, where copyright rules aren't quite as they are in the West, and just manufacture a good old American style hamburger joint and go for it? But they can't. I think you've nailed that one.
Well, and think about competition and its nature. We have in the United States here probably 20 or 30 very good fast food competitors. That
Mm.
keeps quality up and prices low. they're not going to have that over there. So the tendency will be to relax quality standards and raise prices. And that's why it's not a model that works efficiently for the consumer economy. But I do think it's going to be a challenge for the big American and Western brands to deal with these countries that want to exploit their brands for their own purposes without the quality controls underneath the brand. And I think that is a problem that the big guys will have to face.
And in this final part of this story here, McDonald's reserves the right to re enter the Russian market within 15 years. So I think you've made that point quite clear that all businesses will look to exploit a market provided the political landscape allows them to. Steve Beaman, thanks for your time today on World Series News.
I've enjoyed it, and I enjoy being on with you.